He worked actively on the issue of religious freedom in multiple countries and was a key sponsor of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. Prior to his public service, Ambassador Brownback practiced law and taught agricultural law at Kansas State University. We are pleased to partner with Newsweek to host Ambassador Brownback for tonight's discussion. Batya Ungar-Sargon, deputy editor at Newsweek, will serve as tonight's roving reporter. As always, during American Public Square programming, we welcome questions from the audience. Batya will be watching for questions submitted through the Q&A function in Zoom. We will also answer questions that have been submitted in advance by American Public Square members and Newsweek subscribers. Finally, if you're watching on Facebook, you can submit questions for Ambassador Brownback by posting them in the comments section. With that, I will turn it over to our moderators for the evening, Allan Katz, founder and CEO of American Public Square, and our much esteemed program director, Denesha Snell. Allan and Denesha, take it away.
Thank you very much, Claire, and welcome Ambassador Brownback. We know your picture is going to show up in just a second, and we are very, very pleased. Oh, there he is. Okay. Unfortunately, Ambassador Brownback and I share a common facility electronically, and I think it's a function of we're a slightly different generation than a lot of other folks. But welcome, very, very, very pleased to have you, Ambassador. And
I'm pleased to join you, even if it's through my own difficulty that I have to struggle. But thanks.
Believe me, I've just moved to my wife's computer, so I have a similar problem. It really is a pleasure to have you with us tonight. And really, what I wanted to start off with was I read the really interesting article that you were interviewed for in the Kansas City Star earlier this year, and you talked about the issue that was dear to your heart of racial reconciliation. And so I thought that we should sort of start this discussion by saying, in effect, what do you mean by that? What do you see as racial reconciliation?
It's really a society that's reconciled with itself. And we're not the first country to have to wrestle with this. South Africa wrestled with it after apartheid. I've been to Rwanda a dozen years after they had an internal genocide, and they had to wrestle with these sorts of issues. Canada has had to wrestle with New Zealand and Australia with issues dealing with First Nations and then being displaced by European settlers and all the conflict and the treaties and broken treaties that were there. And I kept seeing these issues coming up time and again, and a lot of just heartfelt anger and bitterness towards people's American experience. And you started reaching out to people saying, what do we need to do to resolve this set of issues and to work on it and to actually get to the heart of it? I remember specifically 18 years ago, I met with a group of Native Americans, primarily from Oklahoma, coming into my office and through tears, just expressing, these are the things they were concerned about. And I said, well, what do we need to do? And one of the gentlemen who's since become a good friend, Nigel Big Pond, said, well, I think there needs to be an official apology. I started working on one after that, and it wasn't until 2009 that we got it passed, but we did get it passed. And I think it's that sort of process and vetting to really bring the society and culture together in a factual setting, but to reconcile it is the thing that we've just got to go through as a country.
So, Ambassador Brownback, I want to hear from you, in your opinion, what got us here as a country where we are now? What are the circumstances that got us to this place?
Well, I think it's a long story. Honestly, you can hear people talk about the original sin in America of slavery. I think at its root, really the whole issue that we're talking about is the spilling of innocent blood. I'm a man of faith, and when you spill innocent blood, it defiles the land. The land screams out. And I know that's hard in a Western mind to kind of grasp, what does that mean? But you can see it in people when there's an anger and a bitterness about their experience. And I think we have to go back and address that set of issues of the spilling of innocent blood, particularly of Native Americans and African Americans, that was done in many respects as an aspect of government policy. This was US government policy. And that's where I started getting engaged with it, was not talking about issues that happened communally, but what have we done? We fought a war over this on the African American issue. And yet we still never, kind of went back and said, yes, we did this. It was government policy. It was wrong. We apologize for it as an effort to lance the boil and to try to move the society forward together. We've made great strides, in my estimation, of racial integration and discussions and engagement, but we still haven't really dug into the root of the issue. And until we do that, I think we're going to continue to really periodically struggle with these issues.
So let me ask you this, if I can. How do you see, in the current political climate, do you see an opening for, there being moved towards reconciliation? Because it appears that almost every action has a reaction, and we see, and so many of these things are seen as zero-sum games. How would you think we should, what prospects do you think for going forward, and what would you recommend?
Well, I think we are actually in an era of reconciliation, and I would ask people, if we don't do this, do you think it just gets better on its own? Do you think we've solved the problem? John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, is a friend of mine, and we worked together on the African American Museum of the Smithsonian that's now run by a Kansan. And I carried the bill in a Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican President, and got that through, and it's standing on the Mall today in Washington, D.C. I worked with Byron Dorgan on the Native American apology, which is short, and I could read it here over the air to you. I would just say to people, if we don't do this and go back to the very root of things and have like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, like what was done in South Africa or Rwanda, or an apology ceremony, and moving forward from that, like what was done in Canada or New Zealand, what do you suggest we do to solve the problem? We obviously have an issue here. There's obviously a divide. There's obviously problems. And the government should be in a process of trying to solve or address these sorts of root issue problems dispassionately. That's a really tall order to call for. Bipartisan wise, this would have to be a bipartisan commission to do this. But until we do, you're just not going to get at peace. You're not going to get the resolution. And historically, think about this. We've had different waves of trying to deal with this problem, but never really have we dug into the root of it. And so it just constantly keeps coming back. And that's why I think we're really honestly actually at a season where you could do this. I'm not saying it's going to be easy by any means, but it certainly is time.
So I know, Ambassador, I was reading in a recent article at the Kansas City Star that you quoted and you stated that I think my side, conservatives, need to put forward a racial reconciliation agenda and how we would address it. I want to hear more about your thoughts on conservatives putting forward a racial reconciliation agenda, and what exactly would that agenda look like and address?
Well, I think, to me, what we really need to do is follow the path that some other countries have followed and put forward a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It'd be a high-level commission. Think of the 9/11 Commission, only I think this would honestly be bigger than that. And it has to do two things. Number one, it has to go out and factually dig into the situation of government policies. I'm talking specifically here about US government policies that have been done, and dig out factually what those were and lay them out in front of the country. So that's almost a lawyerly legal review, if you will, of what took place. But again, I suggest dispassionately as possible. because these are radioactive issues. These are really difficult issues, but you dispassionately as possible dig up what was the legal record. When did we first recognize that African Americans were citizens and actually people? Because you go back at first, we put in our Constitution, they were 3/5 of a person. Okay, you need to dig those sort of things up. I think we need to do the same thing with Native Americans, because you have government policy that Native Americans weren't considered people, not even people, until 1880. Those two issues in front of the country for a discussion of what does reconciliation look like. As I said, we've already passed an official apology to Native Americans, and I'd proposed one to African Americans too. It did not deal with any sort of issue of compensation in that at all. We were identifying what happened, what went wrong, what were the official policies, and then left the discussion for later of the actual compensation issues. But I think those are the two things the commission just really needs to dig into as factually and as well as they could.
Taking the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as you said, similar to what they did in South Africa after the end of apartheid. My question for you is, can you see the two parties being able to come together on something like this when they can't even agree on a commission to look at what happened on January 6th? What I worry about is, I think that philosophically, what you're proposing is something that would seem to have universal appeal because it makes sense. But we also recognize we're in a very, very different time now, or a very difficult time now. How do you think we get past that?
Well, let's try. We'll sure not know if we don't try. I know when I first started putting forward the Native American apology and the African American apology, there was quite a bit of pushback in that era about it, but we've got one of them through. And you work with people and you talk with them. You say, this is why we need to do this. And don't be so afraid of it. We can go to the Canadians in New Zealand and say, they said they passed, they did an official apology. The country didn't fall apart. It progressed. These are also issues that now some of our foreign competitors are raising and throwing back at us. President Biden declares an Armenian genocide by the late Ottoman Empire. And what did they say? President Erdogan of Turkey said, I think I'm going to declare a genocide of Native Americans in the United States, what you did. And to me, that then honestly, at the end of the day, plays to our strength. We're a democracy, we're an open society, and we have made we've made mistakes. That has happened. And what you do in an open society is you say, that did happen and it was wrong. We acknowledge that. We ask for forgiveness for that. And now let's try to figure out how we put things back together as we move forward. That's how you deal with original sin, if you will, as what slavery was been referred to in this country. When I'm convicted of my sin, I don't just sit there and just say, I'm just going to take this. I go to God and ask for forgiveness. And there may be consequences of this, but we can ask for it. And this is a very forgiving country too. I think you have to remember that people will, but they want you to know that you did something that was wrong, and acknowledge it. So I'm more optimistic, I guess, than you folks are. Plus, I just don't see another route forward.
I say, let's be optimistic. So let's talk about that. Aside from reparations, which in my opinion is kind of what I hear you saying, what policy would you start with this racial reconciliation? I know that even looking in my own family and the policy that we've been affected by in real time, what do you suggest, in your opinion, what would be the first policy that you would go to and look at, or would it be reparations?
Well, I think you're jumping past the Truth and and reconciliation part. I think you got to first dig out the legal factual setting, and I think you have to dig out as many experts as you can of the consequences. I'm talking now as a policymaker. This is what I would want. I want to know, give me the factual setting here, legally and factually as much as possible. But let me give you an example of this on a micro scale. Georgetown University, about a dozen years ago, acknowledges that they had slaves. They'd owned slaves. They acknowledged that this was wrong. They asked for forgiveness for it. And then they said to the public and to the people, they said, if you are a descendant of these slaves, we will give you admission into Georgetown University and full tuition. We'll pay for all your costs. Now, I don't know even yet today if they've had anybody step up and take them up on that. But I thought that's the sort of process you got to go through. We did it. We acknowledge it. We ask for forgiveness. And here's what we want to do to try to make this right. You know, again, maybe there's too much references here to what I see as a faith analogy, but King David in the Bible breaks his treaty with the Gibeonites. It doesn't rain for 3 years. He goes and he prays to God, says, God, it hadn't rained for 3 years. What's the problem? God says, you broke your treaty with the Gibeonites. He said, I didn't do that. That was Saul that did that. It was somebody else that did that. That's not me. He said, it doesn't matter. You're in the line of succession. And it was what the nation did. So David goes to the Gibeonites and he asks this great question. What must I do that you would bless me? What must I do that you would bless me and bless our people? And I think that sort of candid, deep question is the sort of thing we need to ponder as a nation.
Okay, let's go to our roving reporter, Batya. I imagine you have a question or two that you'd like to direct to the ambassador.
Yes, I do. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. This is already so interesting. I'm going to try to pull a bunch of questions together because we have a bunch of them and they're all really good. So I'm going to read you one question and then I'm going to ask you a sort of larger question to frame it. So here's the question. As a longtime Republican, I have sometimes been embarrassed by Republicans who have voiced sentiments which seem to support less than wholehearted support for racial equality. How would you propose to address that within the party? And I think there's a broader question here, which is that there is one side of the political spectrum that right now is very interested in racial reconciliation, and it's not the Republican Party. So do you have a sense of trying to reform the side that is maybe lacking? Why have you not simply chosen to become a Democrat if this is the number one issue? And sort of just one more thing I'll add on to that, which is that another one of these questions really relates to that. How can Ambassador Brownback square a unifying racial agenda with Republican efforts to eliminate voting opportunities and methods, especially in communities of color? So you can see how all of these questions come together in terms of your identity, your positioning, Ambassador, and this as a major agenda item.
Oh, I'm from Kansas. We started the Civil War. There may be some people that disagree with that, but John Brown, my mother was raised on the property where John Brown would stay when he was in Kansas, and he was referred to as Oswatamy Brown at Harper's Ferry. It was Abraham Lincoln that fought the Civil War and identified the issue of slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation, and he was a Republican. And the state has stood, and we've had our flaws and problems in this state too on racial reconciliation. Brown versus the Board of Education was a case against the state of Kansas for separate but equal. But we've also, I think we've done some right things. So I'm not about to abandon my party when you got a legacy like Abraham Lincoln's, the first Republican president. And also too, and I don't want to get into divisive party politics at this point. I think really you just look for people of good faith and goodwill around. But in my way of thinking, I'm pro-life, and the basis of being pro-life is the inherent beautiful undeniable dignity of each and every person from the very point of start to the very end. And to me, that should be our basis of racial reconciliation, is the inherent dignity and every person's created in the image of God. Now, I fail at that many days, okay? I am by no means perfect. I've got lots of problems. But that should be our goal, and that should be our objective. And I think that's our party's objective, is that inherent beautiful dignity of everybody. And then I think we have to just recognize that there's a deep anger and a bitterness here. And what's the basis of it? Let's start digging into that and solving it. And to me, as a conservative, you don't ignore problems, you address them. Now, the voting rights issue. There are a lot of people looking back and forth on that particular issue and saying, okay, what all happened this last election cycle? And I think some people would look at that and say, you ought to at least have a photo ID to vote. And other people say, well, no, you're being racial injustice on that. I think that's quantifiably or qualifiably different than being against racial justice. Plus, there's just a final point. Maybe I'm going on too long. I think we've got to get back to the root of the issue here. And again, you got to go back to the very beginning on this. And I think you got to deal with that spilling of innocent blood and acknowledge and ask for forgiveness for it.
I have a quick question, Ambassador. You spoke about your party and you spoke about Abraham Lincoln and the Republican and knowing the history of this country and the history of voting. Why do you think that so few Blacks vote Republican?
Oh, I wish I had a better answer for that, because I never did very well with the African-American community, and I worked closely with the African-American community. I think there gets to be sometimes a loyalty issue that people say, I vote Democrat, or I'm a Democrat, or I'm a Republican. And then the two parties work at pushing each to identify and to stay within the boxes that we're in on issues. But I think there's also, a lot of times the Democrats, I think they play better at working on an identity set of issues, where Republicans work better on a broader scale. Say we want to set the framework, and I think Democrats work a lot more on identity, saying we are with you on this topic, and the Republicans would say, look, we want to have a growing economy for everybody. Whether doesn't matter what your racial connection is. And I think that plays to our detriment with the African-American community.
So let me talk about, again, contemporary issues and things that we've seen roil our society in recent years, which really make the whole reconciliation issue that much more difficult. I'd be interested in your view of the Black Lives Matter movement, whether you think that it has been a move, a constructive or a destructive move, and what you think the appropriate response should be.
Yeah, I've done the congressional. We do a pilgrimage. We did a pilgrimage. I don't know if they're still doing it. When I was in Congress twice, I led it, co-chaired it one time to Selma with John Lewis. He would do an annual, or I think he'd do it every Congress, so every 2 years, pilgrimage to Selma. And I went twice there. And I really think the route forward is the way Dr. King went about it, where those guys often, right before they would go out in the march, and certainly before they went across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were in these churches praying. And they were praying for the people that were going to persecute them. And they were praying that this is a non-violent movement. And they were dogged about that. And I really think that's the route forward. And they did a lot of good. They changed this country, and it was tough. And John Lewis would say, and said to me, that the changes that he had seen in his lifetime, there were high schools he couldn't even go into in Georgia when he first started working, that now we're inviting him in to speak. So there's been change, but we're not there yet. We haven't solved these problems. We're better. but we haven't solved them. And I think the route forward is, I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a clear route forward. And I think the way Dr. King did things, I think is the right route forward. I think Black Lives Matter has done a great job for as far as elevating issues. I think, and they state a truism: every life matters, Black lives matter. But I think the route is really this truth and reconciliation process for a country. I'm talking about a nation and dealing with governmental systems, is to do it that way.
So I want to talk a little bit more about, you're talking about Dr. King, and we know that back in the day, a lot of people hated Dr. King, whether he was nonviolent or not. And so I want to hear more about your thoughts on Dr. King and correlating that with our young folks now, and how does this move us as a country forward? How would that help us to progress?
Well, I've read a number of his writings. I've been in some of these places. I'm a great admirer of Dr. King. I wasn't always. I want to also say that to you. I mean, that's, to me, he's really grown in my estimation as I study and I read, and I think he was a prophetic voice to the country. His image still of a beloved community is the one that really is the resonating image that I think we all seek as a nation. And that's where I would take it with the young people. I would take his vision of it. And we've got, my wife and I, we have 5 children, and we got grandchildren, and several of our children are in churches that are much more aggressive about making sure that the church is racially integrated. Where my generation, generally you had an African-American church and you had white churches. There was a lot more division there, but my children, they pick a church that's more racially integrated, and this is a purposeful thing. And I think those are going to help, because at the end of the day, life moves at the speed of relationship. It's relationships that solve problems. And I think we just got to have a lot more depth of relationships across the racial divide. And I think this generation coming up is doing really, in many respects, a phenomenal job of that.
Well, let me just go back again, because I grew up in the 60s and watched the civil rights movement unfold. And what I always, and even with hindsight, look back and realize that many of those changes came about because in effect, large numbers of Americans were ashamed of what they were seeing on their television set. They were ashamed of seeing dogs and fire hoses attacking young children in Alabama. And they thought, this can't be America. This can't be allowed in America. This is not who we are. And yet we had a riot on January 6th, and we have a lot of, our leaders don't seem to be able to figure out a way to even talk about it without accusing each other of all kinds of other things. Are the times so fraught now, Ambassador, that we just can't get to the starting point? Or more importantly, what can we do, and what would you suggest people who are conservatives, who supported President Trump, moving forward, what should they be doing that they're not doing now?
I had a guy give me a vision of a healing highway, that we need to get a healing highway in the United States, but it's overgrown with trees and brush right now. We just haven't figured out how to get people to come together, but I think it's time we start. I think it's time we start talking about these sorts of issues and I've kept using the term dispassionate, but I think we have to talk about things in a factual, calm fashion. So much what passes for debate now is just yelling at each other. And it has to have relationship. There's got to be, we used to do that a lot more in the Congress than what's taking place now, but you just get a couple of people and they can start doing this. And I think we have to cast back to these visions and say, this is not impossible for us. This is America. We change over time, and cast back to that beloved community vision. I've been in meetings where I'm seeing this take place. Now, it's not in Congress, but there's no reason this can't. We just had the National Day of Prayer last week, and Nigel Big Pond, man I mentioned earlier, and I presented the Native American apology there publicly that had passed in 2009. The president needs to present it to Native American leaders. Nigel and I have a strong relationship. We've worked with each other over the years. We did it at the Congressional Cemetery, where 36 tribal leaders are buried, and they're buried there because they came to negotiate with the federal government and caught the disease that they didn't know about at the time. Their bodies couldn't handle, and they died there. So we thought this really an interesting and fitting place. And that happened on the National Day of Prayer, a reconciliation effort. We can build on things like that, and the Congress can pursue things like that. I hope the public doesn't punish them for reaching across the aisle, either way, Republican or Democrat. I used to do bills. I did with John Lewis or with Ted Kennedy. I did a pro-life bill on Down syndrome with Ted Kennedy. And these are great accomplishments. I did the first human trafficking bill with Paul Wellstone, who was killed in a plane crash. These are doable things. I think we just have to try.
So,
go ahead. Right.
I was just going to say, as a woman who was raised in a conservative church, evangelical Christian church, I have some questions about, religious freedom, and you've spoken about the church several times. But what I want to do is hand it over to our roving reporter, Batya, because I see that we have questions from the audience in our Q&A.
Hi. All right, some questions. So first, this is a question from Newsweek subscriber Peter Garcia. Speaking of bipartisan cooperation, Ambassador Brownback, what do you think of the job President Biden has done up until now? How's the president doing?
I think it's early. I think he's spent a ton of money. And the last administration did too. I'm a fiscal conservative, and I look at all of it, and I just think that's more than we can afford to spend. I'm pleased that he's on some of the things he's done, like on China. He hasn't taken the tariffs off, because I think we have to confront China. I think we have to confront them on human rights record. They've continued with the finding of a genocide of the Muslim Uyghurs in Western China. I think those things are good. I'm pro-life, so I don't like the things that he's done on that set of agendas and taxpayer funding of abortion. I think that, to me, this is wrong. This is killing an innocent life. So I think there's a mixed set of issues here at the outset. Joe, I know him. We served together in the Senate. I got along well with him. Enjoyed his company, but to me, it'd be mixed, but those would be some of the things back and forth.
And here's another question from a Newsweek subscriber named Shell. All right, so you have, this is really about your role as U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. That's where this one is coming from. So one person says the free exercise of her religion is prohibited if it's legal for people to do business on Sundays, to have abortions, for physicians to assist in suicide, and if gay marriage is legal. Another person says Congress is making laws establishing religion when making those practices illegal. Which of these two people do you agree with?
I don't know that I would agree with really quite the framing of the question. I understand what you're getting at. To me, the center issue here, and I hope this legitimately gets at your question, is a question of, do you have a freedom of religion, or do you have a freedom of worship? And people might say, well, what's the difference of that? Freedom of religion is that you get to take your beliefs into the public square peacefully. You can't do this violently. You can't go say, I'm going to blow this building up because I think God told me to do it. But also, you're not just confined to your house of worship. where you can express your opinions here, but nowhere else. I believe we have freedom of religion. I believe it's a fundamental right. I believe it's a foundational right. And you're seeing a lot of countries get this wrong, where they're trying to really limit this and just limit it on one and then persecute minority religions, or even there are countries of faith that persecute people that are atheists. And to me, that's a violation of their freedom of religion. So that's where I would really draw the distinction is that I think this is a broad-based fundamental right that you have to be able to take in the public square as long as you're peaceful.
That's so interesting. And it actually gets to another subscriber's question, John Golsby, who asks, and you kind of answered this, but I would love to hear you speak a little bit more about this. Do atheists have religious freedom and equality rights under the law?
Yes, and I've fought for them. There's a case that was happening, still going on in Nigeria, where there was an atheist that was jailed because he was an atheist. And many of us advocated for his release, saying he was being peaceful. This is his set of beliefs. He was expressing them over the internet and got arrested in one of the provinces in Nigeria. And this happens in the Islamic world, actually more frequently. And they absolutely have that right it's a right to believe or not to believe. It's, as a person of faith, to me, it's the right to do with your own soul what you see fit, as long as it's peaceful. Now, if you're going to try to blow a building up, like I said, no. But as long as you're peaceful about it, this is a right you have to do with your own soul what you see fit. And it, to me, is also part of your human dignity. This is your right. This is you. This is your choice. It's a UN-based human right in 1948. It's in our First Amendment. And I believe it's a God-given right.
Well, let me just sort of pick up on this, because obviously it's been clear, not just from tonight's conversation, but in your whole career, that your faith is a very important part of who you are. You talk about it. You're very comfortable talking about it, and you relate it to many of the things that you do and that you have done. So I'd like you to take that, and also certainly in terms of the issue of racial reconciliation, from what you've said tonight, it's a central part of what sort of pushes you in the direction of wanting to achieve this. So I'd like you to take that same focus, and I'd like to sort of take two what I would call ancillary but yet important issues. How does it reconcile with the Muslim ban that President Trump imposed? How does it reconcile with the immigration issues that we've had, family separation, all the other kinds of issues that we've had at the border, assuming, by the way, that all government policy in those cases was well-intended, albeit not carried out particularly well? Where do you think we ought to be going, and what do you think that people of faith should, basically from a policy standpoint, be embracing?
And those are, you go right to good pointed questions. George Bush had a similar issue that came up while I was in the Senate. We had been hit on 9/11, the terrorist, and we could identify major countries where terrorists were coming out of. And there was a limitation put on immigration from those countries. It wasn't called then a Muslim ban. It wasn't a Muslim ban, but the effect of it was on Muslim countries, because that's where these terrorists were originating from. And I found that acceptable in the way of protecting the people of the United States, which I considered one of our primary duties as policymakers, is protection of the people of the United States. That's protecting human life. That's the role the federal government has created, primary role the federal government created for, in my estimation, is protecting people. I don't want to ban any particular group of individuals, and I don't. But if you're going to originate, if we're seeing the origination of a terrorist from a particular area, I think that's in keeping people safe in the country. I believe in legal immigration, not illegal immigration. I would have higher immigration limits in this country, and I'd have a more robust policy opening for immigration. 2 of my children are from overseas. So I have no trouble with immigration, but I want it to be legal. I think everybody, frankly, wants it to be legal. So then you get into the question of, okay, what about the guy then that tries to come across illegally? And I've been on the border. I've interviewed guys that have come across illegally, and asked him, why'd you do it? The guy's telling me, well, look, I was making $7 a day in Guatemala, and I can make that an hour in the United States. I got 3 kids. I'm just trying to feed them. And you kind of, okay, what do you do with that? And on top of it, I mean, to further put the quandary for me, it was Ash Wednesday, where we say ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So at some point in time, that guy that I just interviewed, that's sitting in a makeshift jail on the border, and me are both dead, and we're both ashes. And we think about that on that day. Am I doing what's right for him? And I honestly think a strong border actually prevents a lot of these from taking place. And it's way too long of an answer for you, but I think this point also is important. We take a lot of immigrants in the United States, more than any country in the world, of total immigrants that we take in. A lot of them are forced out of countries, and many times it's because of their religious convictions that they're forced out of countries. And we take people. I think we ought to be pushing on those countries to not kick them out and to allow them to freely practice their faith. That's the kind of shift in policy that we're trying to do, is to make the place safe for them instead of them being forced to leave.
So Ambassador Brownback, you've, as Allan stated before, you've brought up your faith quite a bit. And as a Black woman who was raised in a conservative church, that was mostly, we were one of the few Black families, very few Black families there. I have a deep understanding of the conservative faith and evangelical faith. So wrapped in with this racial reconciliation, I understand how the faith has been used a lot of times to keep people in their boxes or in their place. And I want to talk to you about the tension between the traditional conservative Christian agenda and the goal of religious freedom. I think we can go into the race thing a whole lot, but I think maybe if we focus on the religious freedom, is there a tension between the conservative Christian agenda and the goal of religious freedom? Or is there not one? And how might conservative Christians take the lead to provide greater opportunities for other religions to participate and lead in the public or political spaces of American society?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll have to, admit on my own part, I've been and have been for some period of time just really wrestling with my own thinking on this, because I follow Jesus. I believe he's the Son of God, and I think he loves us all. So when somebody presents a different faith perspective on me, initially, my kind of initial reaction was, well, wait a minute, I don't agree with you. You're not right. And yet what I've really seen in this job is, if we're going to protect my right to religious freedom, we got to protect everybody's right to religious freedom. And it only works if it's for everybody. It doesn't work if it's better for me and not for somebody else. So I thought too, I'm willing to take my faith into the public square and compete against other faiths. And I also think the faith community is the route forward towards peace. I've got an image of having Muslim clerics, Jewish clerics, and Christian clerics all standing together in front of Abraham's tomb and pointing back to this guy that's in that tomb we all claim as our father in this lineage, that guy. So somehow we're all kind of connected here, aren't we then, of those three monotheistic faiths? And as I've gotten to know more Muslim leaders, leaders of other faiths, there's so much in common of a deep desire. Most of the faith all want to pursue love. They all want to pursue human dignity. It's just we get radicalized and divided. And when there's just so much more that brings us together, and it's been a very rich part to me to see we've got to stand for each other. And this is a common human right, and we can stand together. And final point on this, I think if the faith communities don't start coming together and working together in peace, the rest of the world's going to say, heck with all of you. We're going to try to put all of you in a box because you guys lead to too much division instead of coming together. I think we have to start coming together and showing that to the rest of the world.
Well, you sort of preempted my next question, Ambassador. I was going to say, given what we've been talking about tonight, given the notion that reconciliation is something that I think that sort of in a theoretical sense, most people would agree with. They would say, oh, yes, that makes sense. That's something that we should really do. It seems to me that it may be more incumbent upon the faith community, given what they do, to sort of force the political leaders to behave responsibly in terms of moving forward. And their failure to do this to date, is it a sign of a lack of faith, the faith leaders being able to influence things anymore? Is it a lack of commitment on behalf of the faith community? Or is it that the faith community is just more insular and more parochial in their thinking?
You know, you're talking with such a broad brush there on the faith community, because we got thousands of different churches and different things, and so that one's hard that way to kind of lump everybody together. But I think we need to live our faith more. You may look at that and say, well, I don't know if I like that answer, but Gandhi once said he would be a Christian if he ever saw somebody really practice the faith. And he reads the teachings of Jesus, and he just goes, I love this stuff. And I do too. And that's what I want to be like. But I'm a work in progress. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. And I think we just need to actually grow more in our faith. And to be willing to shine it and not be so maybe captured within boxes, but this, Jesus lived this really radical life. I mean, he was always reaching out to the Samaritan or the taxpayer, and he always had difficulty with the religious leaders. That's the place where he had the problems. And I look at that and I ponder that, and then this guiding principle is love. And it meets you wherever you are. So I just think we've got to live our faith more dynamically. And I think that will progress us as a country.
And I think we may have time, Allan, for one more question from our roving reporter.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, Batya, you have something for us? That's where I was going to go.
So many great questions to choose from here. That's really the problem. All right. I want to go back to something that we've been talking about a lot. So in terms of religious freedom and religious beliefs, there's a question here about whether, and I think this will really bring together a number of the different threads. Should it be religious people leading the way on racial reconciliation? Where do you see that? Do you see these two threads of your career, past and future, coming together? And how can you recommend this happening specifically within the Republican Party?
Well, I think absolutely religious people should be at the forefront, just like Dr. King was a minister, a religious person, and he had many ministers that were around him leading the way in the civil rights movement in the 60s that accomplished much. And I think our faith should lead it. And I think we should talk about this common thread of the spilling of innocent blood that I think everybody can kind of identify with, whether you're a person of faith or not. If you spill innocent blood, and these are, this to me, and some people may have problems with this, but you got three big streams of spilled innocent blood in this country. You've got what happened to the Native Americans, and there was atrocities back and forth, but there was a lot on our side of the white settlers, African Americans, and the forced slavery, and abortion. Now, some people agree, disagree with that, but spilling of innocent blood. And these are like three veins that are woven together, and they all have this common thread to them. And that's why I think we've really got to get back to the basic of that issue and recognize the trauma that it's visited on the country continuously and will continue to until we actually deal with the roots of these problems.
You know, as we reach a conclusion of this program, Ambassador, we oftentimes ask our guests, now what? In other words, what would you, if you were to issue, if you will, a clarion call to the people who are watching this both tonight and who will watch it, you know, and once it's been recorded and reposted, what would you say? You know, I'm Sam Brownback. This is what I think we need to do in terms of racial reconciliation in this country, and this is what you would like for people to accept as a personal responsibility.
Two things. One is really, I think it's time for the president to bring in the Native American tribal leaders from across the country and to present the official apology publicly to them and to the nation and to the world. That's something I'd asked of the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and I asked of the Biden administration. That's there. The law has passed. The apology is written. It just got to be presented by the president. It has to happen for that piece to start. And then the second, I think I asked for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to deal factually, to dig factually in with our past and present its findings to the country and to the world on particularly the treatment of Native Americans and of African Americans. Those are the two things I'd ask for.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being with us. I'm going to turn it over to Denesha now to close. It's been an honor to have you, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Allan. Thank you, Batya. And thank you, Ambassador Brownback, for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure. And I think we probably could have filled a couple hours worth of questions with this program. So I want to thank everyone who made this program possible, including the staff and volunteers with American Public Square. I also want to take a quick moment and thank our sponsors for tonight's program, William Jewell College, Marnie and John Sherman, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, and PlexPod, where I'm located this evening. I would also like to thank all of you who tuned in for tonight's program. At the conclusion of this event, you'll be directed to a short post-event survey. Please take a few moments to complete this survey. It helps us as we put on future programs. It helps us to improve our events and lets us know what kind of programs our supporters want to see. Finally, if you enjoyed this program and believe that conversations like this are important, please consider becoming a member of American Public Square. APS members support our programs and allow us to continue providing a space for civil, fact-based discussion. You can learn more about membership and its benefits by visiting our website, americanpublicsquare.org. Once again, thank you. We here at American Public Square, thank you for joining us. Have a great evening and see you soon. Thank you again, Ambassador Brownback. Have a great evening.
Thank you.